do. What a pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Stephen Sawyer. He's a professor of history, and he's also the chair of the International Comparative Politics Department at AUP. A brilliant writer about political history, democratic theory. He is the co-founder of the History, Law, and Society program at AUP and the director of our Center for Critical Democracy Studies. That center is the one that hosted, or co-hosted, I should say, with the Harvard Kennedy School, our centennial conference last year on the Paris peace settlements of 1919, 100 years later, reflecting back on them. And we have a second conference planned for next spring at Harvard this time. Last year, Steve held a prestigious fellowship at Stanford Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. I think he was working on volume 2 of an extraordinary book that he produced, that he published last year, called Demos Assembled: Democracy and the International Origins of the Modern State, which was published by the University of Chicago, his alma mater. I want to say about Steve that he has a very special interest in democracy and pedagogy. He's interested in the teaching of democracy, and he's interested in revitalizing democratic institutions by using the classroom as a kind of laboratory. So he meets with freshmen. He created this thing called the Democracy Lab, which is a follow-up to a freshman seminar on democracy. And then there's a summer institute where he brings in colleagues. He also edits the Tocqueville Review, the prestigious Tocqueville Review, and a website called Tocqueville 21, I believe. Is that its name, Steve? Which includes blogs and articles, and is a sort of live version, really, of the journal, which is more scholarly in tone. And basically, these democracy labs are built to empower students to believe that they can have an impact on democratic institutions, and to draw attention to the fact that democracy is in a little bit of trouble in our age. Finally, I want you to know that Steve is planning for a very exciting conference coming up about a year from now, called Demos 21, What Democracy for the 21st Century. And we're looking forward to a whole week of celebrations on the AUP campus about a year from now. And so you'll hear lots more about that in the future. So tell us about how big debt pays off, Steve. Looking forward to hearing you tonight.
Thank you, Celeste. Thank you, Celeste, and thank you, Mary. Can everybody hear me? Is this working out okay? Okay. So there were a number of things that that Celeste mentioned that I would be thrilled to talk about, but including the Democracy Lab. This year we had a particularly extraordinary group of students with the Democracy Lab. Happy to speak about that if people are interested. But the reason we're gathered here tonight is to ask this question about when big debt did pay off and how that was. As you may know, I am a historian of the 19th century, primarily 18th and 19th century, from the French Revolution through World War I. And so I have a certain certain kind of historical vision coming out of this crisis. Now, there's no doubt that since the beginning of the crisis, there has been no shortage of historical comparisons to make sense of these extraordinary times that we are living in. Looking for lessons from the past, we have seen historians, economists, scholars of all sorts look back to the past for lessons on what will come, trying to make sense of what we've experienced. We have reflected upon the medieval bubonic plague or the Spanish flu of 1918-1919 to gain perspective on public health emergencies. And likewise, as public money rains down on the world's wealthiest economies through the accumulation of massive debt for what is effectively the nationalization of salaries in many countries, and helicopter money almost seems to be something that we talk about every day now, historians are also looking for precedents within public finance. The most obvious comparisons have been drawn with the Great Depression and the massive stimulus injected into the American economy in the 1930s, as well as, in the European context, the Marshall Plan designed to rebuild Europe following the Second World War. Of course, these comparisons are telling, but as useful as they may be, they are not entirely comparable. For example, during the Great Depression, and in 2008 as well, as Marc-Olivier Strauss-Kahn discussed in the last presentation, the problem was essentially financial as opposed to economic. That is, in 1929, a financial shock hit the United States and spread across the world, and later sort of accumulated into a collapse of the economy. Whereas today, we're facing quite the opposite situation. A majority of the world's population was simply forced to stay at home. So the entire sort of process of economic production was reduced to a trickle. The financial consequences in the stock markets around the world, as many of you know, remain largely unclear, but they are a result of this economic shock. As for the Marshall Plan, it came after almost a half decade of the most destructive total war the world has ever seen, dwarfing even the tragic number of deaths and sick brought on by the coronavirus. So alongside these comparisons, our understanding of what has happened and projections for what might happen should also push us to look elsewhere. I'd like for us to take a step just a little bit back, a little further back in history, back to the 19th century, where I think a fitting comparison is to be found in the fiscal, financial, economic consequences of a short period from 1870 to 1871, especially in France and on the European continent, that surrounded the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune, the Paris Commune, but there were other communes as well. Now, let me just provide you with a brief background on this period. 1870-1871 marks the transition from what is known in France as the Second Empire, so prior to 1870 is the Second Empire, to the first lasting Republican regime in France. Now, it was called the Third Republic. The First Republic had lasted essentially a few years in the 1790s, just after the French Revolution, before it was replaced with the Consulate and then the Napoleonic Empire as of 1799. So it really only lasted about 7 years. The Second Empire lasted about 4 years, from 1848 to the end of 1851. And the Third Republic starts in 1870. And it lasts until the Second World War. It is still the longest lasting republic in France. We are now, as I'm sure all of you know, in the Fifth Republic in France, and many people are calling for the Sixth. But the Third Republic is still the longest Republican regime. It was the first lasting Republican regime. So this period, 1870 to 1871, marks a break in terms of the regime. Now, just a few words about this regime of the Second Empire. From 1852 to 1870, the Second Empire was governed by, or ruled, you could say, by the nephew of Napoleon, or Napoleon I. This nephew's name was Napoleon III. Now, I'd be happy to say much more about this individual if you are interested in the Q&A, but let me just highlight three essential characteristics of this regime, which are important for what I'd like to talk about in terms of how big debt pays off. First, the Napoleonic regime was an extremely original regime type. It was the first regime that we know of to have referred to itself as what they called a democratic dictatorship. That is, Napoleon III maintained the universal suffrage that had been established by the Second Republic in 1848 for elections and for plebiscites, which are essentially the equivalent of a referendum. But he was not elected. And he centralized all executive and administrative power into his own hands. To Napoleon III and those who supported him, and there were many, especially in the French countryside, this was what democracy should look like. They argued that the French Revolution and the 1848 revolution were signs that democracy was too chaotic and could not deal with the complexities of modern life. And they say, they argued that in order for democracy to function, a modern democracy would have a sort of dictatorial executive power along with elections beside it. This regime type then has been compared to what we currently refer to as democratures. And I don't know if you've heard this term, but it's commonly used, sometimes applied to regimes like Putin, to some extent Turkey, and others. So that's the first point. Modern democracy as a democrature. This is what Napoleon III thought. Second, in many ways, this period from the 1850s to the 1860s marked the zenith of French power. France was by far the dominant power on the continent. One thing you always have to keep in mind is that prior to 1871, Germany simply didn't exist. In the same way that France was very powerful in Europe from during the Cold War, when Germany was divided, France absolutely dominated the continent until Germany was created as a result of the Franco-Prussian War. Russia was still mired in a peasant economy. The US was still dominantly rural and was going through a civil war, and the 1850 compromises, a whole set of sort of issues that were preventing it from acting as a powerful force on a world scale. And certainly no other continental power had a world empire like the one that France did. France moved into Indochina during this period. It strengthened its hold over North Africa, and it also placed a dictator for a brief period on the throne of Mexico, Maximilian. That was short-lived, but the fact that they were able to even establish a dictator on the throne of Mexico gives you a sense of their world power. It was without a doubt, France was without a doubt one of the most powerful countries in the world, probably second only to Britain. Third, the extraordinary ambition, perhaps best represented by the reconstruction of Paris that we have all come to love so much. The Paris that we now know, with its beautiful boulevards everywhere from the Boulevard Saint-Germain to the Boulevard, l'Avenue de l'Opéra, or the Opéra Garnier, the completion of the Louvre, the extraordinary parks. All of this was the empire's doing. Paris became the centerpiece of a world empire. Now, to return more directly to the subject of this talk, maybe as you've walked around Paris, on occasion you've thought, how did they pay for this? How did they pay for this massive reconstruction, which was largely accomplished in about 16 years between 1854 and 1870? Now, when I say the reconstruction, I don't mean all of the buildings, and we'll talk about that during the question and answer period if you'd like to know more about that. What I'm talking about is just the basic layout of the streets and the construction of the streets. So how did they fund this? Well, frankly, they did it with debt. By the end of the regime, Paris had a staggering debt that no city in the world had ever had, and they still hadn't paid that debt off by World War I. Now, they were able to finance that debt through an extraordinary system of taxation that they had around the city. There was a tax wall around the city. They taxed all goods coming in and out of the city. It would essentially be the equivalent of a city value-added tax or a city sales tax today. But they had it, every good that came into the city, from wine to food to whatever you can imagine, was subject to a small tax. It gave Paris an income and a revenue stream that was higher than most European states, most small European states. So this is the regime that was in place in 1870. It had been in place for almost 18 years. Now, in the summer of 1870, Napoleon III decided that he would attempt to preserve France's place as a dominant power on the continent, and used a very silly pretext to declare war on Prussia, which was not yet Germany, as I said. The consequences of this decision were extraordinary, both in the short and in the long term. No doubt, Germany would have consolidated and unified anyway. But as it turned out, France was quickly defeated. The Prussians laid siege on Paris for over 2 months. They declared their German empire. They took Alsace and most of Lorraine. They forced France to pay an extraordinary package of reparations of $5 billion. It is with this war that the explosive tensions between France and Germany were crystallized, erupting into the devastating world wars of the 20th century. So what exactly might we see in terms of connections with the current crisis? First, as opposed to, let's say, World War I or World War II, the Franco-Prussian War was relatively short, stretching from July 1970 through January 1871. Most of the fighting took place during the first 2 months, followed by the devastating Prussian siege on Paris through January. The war finally came to an end with a Treaty of Versailles. The 150th anniversary of this Treaty of Versailles will be in February of next year, in 2021. But I think we'll that's a less pleasant memory for the French, because the French had been sorely defeated, and there was no attempt to create anything like a new system of international governance like we would have in 1919. Moreover, frustrated by the series of military defeats and the peace treaty, animated by their revolutionary convictions, revolutionary movements called communes broke out across France. Among them, the Paris Commune erupted on March 18th and lasted through the end of May, more or less the duration of the confinement we have just experienced. All the more intense for its brevity, the Commune has captured political and social imaginaries ever since. Most historians have obviously recognized the importance of the Franco-Prussian War for bringing an end to the Second Empire, shifting the balance of power on continental Europe, sowing the seeds of World War I, and definitively establishing a republican government in France. There was, however, another tectonic and perhaps less well-known transformation that took place during this period, what I refer to as a fiscal revolution. Let me explain. The economic, financial, and ultimately fiscal consequences of these 10 months were extraordinary, even if they have been somewhat underappreciated. In spite of its brevity, the total bill for the war and the Paris Commune was approximately 7 to 9 billion francs. Now, let me put that into perspective. That was roughly 4 times the annual budget. So for those of you who like figures, that in today's terms for France would be the equivalent of a bill of 1.4 trillion euros. As an article in April 1871 argued, it was not just a question of paying the 5 billion in reparations to the new German Empire, but also of paying for the massive expenses that had been contracted over this brief period of destruction in Paris and the consequences of the war, including paying those who had been who had lost loved ones, etc. And to make matters worse, Germany added a clause to this Treaty of Versailles of 1871 that the German army would occupy much of France at France's expense until the massive bill of reparations was paid. Now, how would it even be possible to pay back these kinds of sums in a short enough period of time such that France could once again be sovereign within its own borders, have paid off the Germans, and be able to gain some sort of credibility as a new republic? Keep in mind, of course, that in the context of the Second Empire, France had reached its apogee. We have now replaced the Second Empire with a third republic, which is coming out of a defeat and which has a massive bill to pay. So how did they build this credibility, and how did they accomplish this massive payment? The immediate repayment of the war reparations and debt was made possible through the first, most unprecedented borrowing by the French state. Keep in mind, France really only had one experiment with massive debt prior to this occasion, and that was the construction of Paris. And even that had been highly contested, especially by Republicans who did not like Napoleon III and claimed that it was frankly irresponsible to rebuild a city by borrowing such extraordinary sums. So the problem in the case of French borrowing in 1871 was not only to convince the Republicans that this should be done, but quite simply, how was it to be financed? As we all know, it's not an easy thing to finance public borrowing. Well, it was achieved by a new tax policy. And it's this new tax policy that marked nothing short of a fiscal revolution. In many ways, the numbers of this fiscal revolution simply speak for themselves. Can we put up the first slide here? I don't know if people can see it. I am, okay, there it is, great. Okay, so what you're looking at here are the revenues. Now, do you see that massive spike there? That massive spike is between 1869 and 1870. And essentially what it is telling you is that state revenues doubled in 1 year. When the average for the decade from 1860 to 1869 is compared to the average for the following decade, we see that there was approximately an increase of 45% overnight. And as this diagram shows, the state's income never went back down to former levels. It dropped down briefly and then shot back up by 1875. And by 1880, it achieved almost 4,000,000 francs mark, that is the 4 billion franc mark, and never went down again. This transformation was no less radical. Oh, wait, can I see the next slide there, Holly? This was similar in the case of public debt. Take a look. Between 1870 and 1900, the public debt almost triples. The transformation, therefore, was also no less radical in the realm of public expenditure as a share of GDP. What I mean by that is the GDP is essentially the gross domestic product of France, how much money is being generated by France on the one hand, and what share of that is going into public spending. The average prior to 1870 hovered around 10%, roughly. It shot up to almost 20% the following year in 1870, and it never went back down. Between 1871 and 1879, similarly, the share of public spending on the debt also witnessed a remarkable rise, almost doubling in 1870. That is how much the state paid for its debt, okay? How much the debt was costing the state, doubled in 1 year. And it is particularly striking that in spite of the massive increase in revenue and state debt, the French GDP grew at a far more reasonable pace. In other words, in the 1870s, the state was able to increase its revenues by more than 45%. It was able to increase its debt. It increased its debt by 77%. And it increased its public spending by over 58%, all of this in 1 decade.
Stephen,
as a result,
can I interrupt for a second?
Yes, of course.
Could you say, there's one question that's been asked here. How would those numbers you're throwing around in terms of percentages compare to, say, today, if you happen to know?
Well, it's the same, right? So
Thanks.
if we talk about, let's say we talk about public debt, we'll say France is currently at 99% public debt. Right? These are the kinds of figures that we throw around, or it's hovering around 100% of public debt. Well, this is the equivalent of going from 100% public debt to 177% public debt in 1 year. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Germany, we say, is sort of the good student of Europe. I think their public debt hovers around 66%. This would be the equivalent of Germany going from 65 or 66% to 77% more, so roughly 140% in 1 year. And the fact is, it never went back down. Essentially, what we're talking about, for anybody who, I don't know if you read these kinds of somebody just said something.
Yep. Did you hear that? Marc Olivier said public debt after 1880 stood at around 50 to 60%.
Yeah, so if we put up the figures there, so public debt in 1860 hovers around it hovers around this is in millions, okay? So it hovers around 10 million, okay? 10 million 10 million billion, or here, let me go back here. So state revenues are approximately 2,000 million, okay? Public debt is approximately, is approximately, as you can see on the table there. These figures are all from the apogee in the fall. I would say Germany was below 60% until very recently, following decisions on expenditure. Yeah. So what I'm saying, yeah. So that's a very good point. So Germany is making tremendous efforts. Maybe you've noticed that Germany is accredited with approximately 51% of all the spending that's going into economic to try to return and improve the economic situation in Europe right now. And they're as Achim Kluber just said, it's going up approximately 20%. Well, this would be the equivalent of going up 77%, okay? And I can give you the exact figures. I'm trying to find the exact figures for, but they're on the table there. But essentially what we're talking about is 10,000 million, okay? So about 10 billion, and it goes up to approximately, and it goes up, and it goes up about 4 times by 1900. But we can go through the details on that in a moment, and I have them all. By the way, I should mention this article was published in the American Historical Review, and it's a much longer version of what I'm talking about here. So if you're interested, I can send you to that. Okay, so what was this miraculous tax policy that allowed them to fund these extraordinary expenditures? How did they essentially how did they raise their tax revenues to such an extraordinary degree? Now, in fact, the revolutionary nature of this transformation was not the product of inventing new modes of taxation. They maintained the system of taxation that France had been using since the Revolution. Now, while Great Britain had created an income tax in the mid-19th century, nothing of this sort existed in France. It wouldn't exist until the First World War. Now, many tend to argue that the real fiscal revolution in France came with the First World War. But the argument here is that the first fiscal revolution started much earlier in 1870, 1871. They relied instead on indirect taxes, or what we would now call a VAT, sales tax, tariffs, customs duties, property taxes, etc. Now, the French kept this system, but where they innovated was both in the deployment of this instrument and by deploying it on an entirely new scale and toward a whole range of new areas under the Third Republic. So while France had a long history of using indirect taxes, the sheer amount of money gathered through these taxes on either side of the 1870 divide was simply jaw-dropping. The state used the receipts from the massive increase in taxes from 1871 to 1873 to cover the debt and the cost of reparations resulting from the war, paying the reparations at an astonishing rate and acquiring the resources necessary to repay those loans in record time to force German troops to leave the French state, the French territory. As figure 3, can we show the third slide there, Holly? Okay. So here we have, for example, okay. So yeah, here we can go back to this one's kind of hard to see. This is, let's go on to the next one. That is total expenditures, debt, and financing of debt. But let's go to the last one there, Holly. Or yeah, there we go. Okay. So this is essentially what they use their money on. Okay, how they're spending their money. So let me just run through some of these things, what they're going to do, because once they have paid off, so they increase their revenues, they massively increase their debt, and then they pay off the Germans, and they pay off their debt, or they pay off what they owe to the Germans, and they finance their debt, and then they keep charging, they keep maintaining those same revenues. Okay, so where does that money go? If they've already paid off the $5 billion to the Germans, what are they doing with the money now? Okay, and what they do is public spending on civil projects during the Third Republic soars. The expenses for public works tripled between 1872 and 1877, for example. Similarly, if we compare the expenses of the Ministry of War to the expenditures on public instruction in the early Third Republic, we see that the respective budgets went in opposite directions. So the blue line of what you're looking at is the funding that goes to the Ministry of War. Okay, so it plummets, as you can see. That's the blue line. The red line is what is going into public instruction. Okay, in the early Third Republic, and so they're going right. So that one keeps growing, and the war budget never reaches what it was under the Second Empire. Essentially, the Ministry of War and the overall annual budget of France plummeted by more than half, from 35% to 17%, while the share for public instruction almost doubled during the same period. From 1871 to 1899, the ratio of expenses in the Ministry of Public Instruction to expenses in the Ministry of War in terms of their share of the budget decreased more than tenfold. That is, that there was a sort of tenfold decrease in how much you spent on the war, the ratio of how much you spent on war to how much you spent on public instruction. Charles Gide, who was a leading economist and a huge supporter of the income tax. So he did not like this system. He thought that what was necessary was to create an income tax. Even Charles Gide recognized that strong investment in education was a bright spot in France's indirect tax structure. I can quote him. He said, "Of all services, that which has increased the most, and this is a happy consolation among so many others that are disheartening because he wanted an income tax, is that of public instruction. The new policy may originally, therefore, have been implemented as a means to pay off war debt, but it quickly became a long-term peacetime resource. The directing of increased peacetime tax revenue to civil investments in the Third Republic reveals the revolutionary quality of fiscal transformations that can follow relatively short periods of radical change." The president of the French Republic at the time, Adolphe Thiers, famously quipped, "In the realm of taxation, what is necessary to change an entire system?" He responded, "A seasonal accident." Considering the extraordinary events since the corona outbreak, he may just be right. Thank you.
That was terrific, Stephen. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions on here, and without any permission to do so, Marc Olivier, could I ask you to ask your question in real time by unmuting yourself and asking your question of Stephen? Because there's such a direct follow-up from your presentation last week.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Stefan, first, apologies for having involuntarily disturbed your talk, because I didn't know that you were able to follow the chat. Second,
Yes.
I think you were right, and France debt over GDP was around 100% after the war. The 50% I was referring to was more the average of the so-called developed economies. And Akim
yes.
may be happy that Germany apparently was well below that.
Okay.
Then my question was the following, but it might be a question more important for economists. Over the 19th century, public debt, or most of the debt, was perpetual debt, consols. That is to say, people just got the service of the debt. And after the First World War, people were worried and they asked to be reimbursed also as regards the capital, the principal. How important is that from your viewpoint?
Yeah, it's a very important question. Yes. So the obviously one of the real consequences of this debt. So big debt does pay off, but it pays off in a number of ways. It pays off because it gave the Third Republic the opportunity to do massive new investments in infrastructure and education, among other things. But it also paid off, as you're suggesting, to anybody who could buy into this system, right? Because, of course, a lot of this debt is being purchased as a kind of, as a form of a kind of government bond. And these bonds the interest rates on these that were issued by the Banque de France could go up to between 5 and 7%. And the amortization of these bonds, as you're pointing out, was not something that was at the center of what they were trying to do. And so when they would choose to pay off certain debts more quickly than others, and there were constant debates about which ones they should amortize and which ones they should not. But the ones that they felt that they could be perpetual, as you're talking about, and were most commonly perpetual, were also those that went directly into the pockets of what we refer to as rentiers, right? Those people who bought these government bonds, individuals and families. And as anybody who has relatives in France knows, it was actually, there was a massive democratization of debt in the 1870s and 1880s. It is not rare at all to find little bonds or little sort of signs of this individual borrowing in your, in the attics of houses in the provinces or things like this. But of course, there were also borrowing from major financial banks, the major bankers of out of London and of course in Paris. And then there were also others who borrowed, very wealthy individuals who lent large amounts of money. But of course, as we all know, France was on a bimetallic system, so there was no such thing as sort of quantitative easing. You couldn't just print money. But yes, that's a very important question. Thank you.
So we've had a couple of people weigh in on different sides of the, what I would say, multi-trillion-dollar question, which is, should we anticipate that taxes will automatically or surely go up as a result of COVID-19? And Achim Kluber comments, not necessarily. It depends on how growth rates following the solution on the virus and interest rates at which the governments are borrowing. In his humble opinion, I should be sure I add that tagline and ask you to comment on that question and comment.
Yes, no, absolutely. So there are a couple of things. So first of all, France was borrowing at a very high interest rate. As I said, some of this debt was being reimbursed as high as 6 to 7%. Some of it was at 3%. It was dependent on how the debt was actually structured. But these revenues were from taxation. Now, the debate in the 1870s and 1880s, as I said, is should we pay for this through income tax or should we pay for this through these indirect taxes? They decided to do these indirect taxes. Now, obviously, countries today have various versions of this, but there's usually some form of income tax and some form of indirect taxes, right? So that debate is now over. If you want to raise taxes, it's obviously very difficult in a time of kind of economic pressure, right? So one of the ways you can do this, which would be I would suggest the equivalent of what Pierre did and what they did in the 1870s, would be creating a kind of progressive VAT or a progressive sales tax. That would be the equivalent of what they did. That is, if we said, at the time, they would say, oh, there's no way we can do an income tax because it would be essentially invading people's privacy. It would be a sort of surveillance state. We could never do that. Well, of course, we did do it. And most democracies do have an income tax, and Britain already had one. So that wasn't a very good argument. And now we say, well, how could we possibly organize a progressive sales tax, right? Because the problem with the sales tax is that it's a flat tax. So if you introduce a sales tax in a time of sort of economic crunch, like what we're going through right now, of course, people will just, they won't buy things, right? Or it'll slow down buying. But if you created a progressive sales tax, you know, that might work. And it sounds crazy, but if we said, I don't know, I mean, we could talk about how possible that would actually be, but it would certainly generate the kinds of revenues that we're talking about that they generate at the time. And yes, and so therefore the comment is absolutely right. I mean, it depends on how much they're buying. Now, of course, there is a completely different situation now, and I'm sure some of you have followed these debates on modern monetary theory, MMT, and this idea that, frankly, when you're producing your own currency, when you are a sovereign currency, you can actually print as much money as you want. There are a number of economists that are arguing that as long as you don't, it's a question of scale, as long as you don't disrupt, if you put everybody on a salary of 2,000 euros a month in France, you're not going to create massive inflation. What you have to avoid is all of a sudden giving large numbers of people huge salaries. In any case, that's a debate that's going on. Some people think that's completely insane. Other people are defending this. Very serious economists are defending this argument. But that, of course, is not possible at this time. There is no such thing, since you are on a bimetallic system. That's not possible. But yes, absolutely, it does depend on the interest rates and the economic growth afterwards.
Thank you. So we are coming to the end of this hour together, and as we all expected, it has flown by. We have a few more minutes, so if anybody has a question to post, please do so now. And I'm going to say two things. First, Stephen had a fabulous posting on the Learning Laboratory on the AUP Digital Campus. Just posted today that talks about some of these issues. So I'm going to post the link there in a minute, and we'll send it in the follow-up email to thank you for coming, which will direct you there so you can watch his brief summary of the same issues we've discussed today. And I want to read a comment that Marc Olivier posted that says, my guess is there will be more taxes, but as late and as softly as possible in order not to kill the recovery, which is good news, I think we all think. Some inflation, possibly above 2% for a while, will reduce the ratio, and the central banks may roll over their holdings of debt.
Yeah, and that is exactly the first point that was just made is exactly what Pierre was trying to do. That is, how do you raise taxes without, sort of creating a situation in which people are completely frightened? And that is why Pierre one of the reasons why he did not want the income tax. He said, if we create the income tax now, we're going to erode all support for the Third Republican regime. And it will just panic people because obviously the economy was poorly hit.
Great. And I love the fact that one of your fellow faculty members, James Ward, you mentioned earlier, we need an economist for this. Et voila, we have an economist on the call today, on the Zoom today, James Ward. And James sort of twisted his arm a bit, but he'd like to jump in and ask a couple of questions. James,
Oh, with
unmute
pleasure.
yourself.
Hi, Stephen.
Hi, James. Thank you for coming this evening.
It's a marvelous presentation, fascinating period of history. So thank you so much for digging into this. Thanks for pointing out on the bimetallicism comparison with inflation that there really couldn't be the same mechanism there. I will quibble with you a bit on that, in that the amalgams that they put into the coinage did decay, which they did in the Roman times, and they did in the Greeks as well. So it wasn't quantitative easing as we currently understand it, but it was quantitative easing for people of the banking systems of the time. So, you know,
although I will add that that was an issue, but you know, there was what they called the Monetary Union of Latin countries, which was mostly in West, and they did work on that that was something they were more worried about than something they were trying to,
and created wonderful arbitrage opportunities for you to take silver from Italy and turn it into French coins, or French coins into Italian coins.
It was a standard relationship. So, you know, if you buy one with the other, you're just making money. Yeah.
One of the things about the data that you pointed out there on the drop in the military, though, part of that budget was explained by the fact that there was the purge of both the budget and the personnel of the National Guards, because the National Guards were leftist and they had been purged in the 1870s. And so that cut in both the salaries, the positions, and the pensions of those people as well. So Absolutely. A lot of the military budget was just reduced down to simply the Army. So that explains quite a lot of that drop in there, that the National Guards were essentially purged, and that's but that did create the opportunity to redirect resources in other areas, but it was at the expense of a large portion of what had previously been security forces of the wrong political persuasion.
Yes, absolutely. Now, you're absolutely right. Now, there are a couple of things there. So one, the point here is to show that what is generally, there is in social science, there's this general argument, as you know, that war makes states, right? That you only have sort of real development and fiscal capacity and in a state when you need to pay for war. And what I wanted to show there is that actually they lessen, they reduce their, if you will, expense on military power as they're building this new Republican state capacity. Now, what they're also, the second point then is that what they're also going to do is Pierre is going to completely redefine the army. In, you know, the first 10 years of the Third Republic is really about rebuilding the French army, creating a whole new sort of Republican system, that versions of which were remained well into the 20th century. So they're also trying to use the money smarter, but there are all kinds of things that they cut out of the Second Empire budget. And the point is that they increase their capacity at the same time that they decrease their defense, and in many ways they decrease bureaucratic autonomy. That's the sort of interesting part of this story.
Mm-hmm. And then the one other thing I wanted to point out that I thought was compelling and interesting in that period from a financial standpoint was the time of the Franco-British effort for the Suez Canal, and quite a lot of the debt for that also played into the fact that people had choices on, they could loan money to a French effort that was semi-nationally backed, but also semi-nationally backed by Britain. So that had an influence on both the interest rates that people had choices on what they could invest in, but it was also an expansion of economic opportunity that was, you know, very far reaching into the future, but also keeping in check the German forces at that time. So this was a joint effort. In many ways, one of the first seeds of, say, an economic union in Europe was the financing of the Suez Canal, which was in 1875 and came out of this same movement that you identified here so well. Yeah,
absolutely. No, that's absolutely right. People, there were, you know, and you're absolutely right on that. And as I said, there were a lot of different bond options. People were also starting to buy a lot of bonds for building railroads in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, which were also sort of backed by the French government. And so there were just a lot of opportunities to lend money, and you could buy bonds at incredibly low levels. You didn't have to put in, thousands of francs to get one of these bond certificates. And, they paid, because there were so many options, they paid between 3 and 6%. I mean, a standard 6% return on an investment of 100 or 150 francs is a very impressive return on investment, obviously, at that time. So, of course, there are much fewer people who can actually do this. I mean, I guess the thing to mention is that this system, what is being done in this kind of a system is that obviously when you have this kind of a bond holding, it is democratized, but it does tend to make the rich, the wealthy, wealthier. And the only sort of exchange is that it does build better infrastructures for the general population. And that is, in particular, two of the great legacies of the Third Republic, that is infrastructure and the school system.
Thank you, Stephen, for providing the perfect segue to the last question I think we have time for. And I love the fact that it comes from a very recent AUP graduate, Sebi Loudon, who graduated on Monday from our master's program, and from Tori Griffiths, one of our former AUP staff members. So the whole community is coming together here. And James, don't go far. I don't know who should answer this. So here's the question. On the subject of debt, how can countries that do not compare to France, such as highly indebted poor countries, mitigate the lasting economic effects that COVID has presented when they can't print more money or raise more revenues?
This is exactly why there's so much discussion about either pushing back, paying off debt, or just forgiving debt for many of the countries that have had to borrow. It's obviously also, it's not just a problem it's obviously a major problem for countries that can't even come close to paying some of the debt that they have taken on through IMF or through other sort of international systems. But it's also a problem for countries like Italy and Spain, right? That if Europe says, well, this is a loan, you're going to have to pay this back, obviously at some point they're thinking, I don't think we'll be able to pay this back. So this is obviously a major issue. And without some, there is this modern monetary theory, there is this idea that we can just print money, but without some technologies and some sort of new ways of thinking about how we're going to deal with debt, it seems clear that we are ripe for something new.
Okay, we are coming to the close. We have 4 minutes left. I'm going to ask Stephen my new favorite question on these sessions, which is, tell us something on this subject that we could throw out at a virtual cocktail party and sound smart about what you've just told us so much about.
Well, there are a couple things. So one is that this is the beginning of the French sort of fiscal, the sort of very effective use of indirect taxes, including sales taxes. As many of you may know, the income tax obviously brings in large percentages of income to the French state, but the VAT, the TVA, and indirect taxes still are a larger portion than the income tax, and that starts in this sort of moment of 1870, that is using those kinds of taxes to pay for financing major public spending. I guess the second is that indirectly, this is a very interesting moment, because it is the moment, the Third Republic is in many ways a kind of ideal, it's referred to as the Belle Époque. By the time we get to the turn of the century, it is an extraordinary moment for France culturally. It is an extraordinary sort of set of political contributions through the Third Republic. It is extraordinary in terms of just literature, and many of the French cuisine very much comes into its own during this period, these early years of the Third Republic. And so in some ways, this Third Republic that was faced with this overwhelming debt burden and created this new system did, in many ways, come out and create some of the greatest moments of 19th century French history are a result of this period, indirectly or directly. So, that's something you can mention.
James just held up a piece of paper and said Zola.
Zola, par exemple. Par exemple.
I was also going to mention, for those of you who like collecting old documents, that the bonds printed in this era, because of its Belle Epoque influence, they're quite beautiful documents.
They are beautiful.
Yeah, great. Well, there you go, 12:59 or 6:59. So thank you so much, Stephen. Celeste, any final comments?
Oops. I'm trying to unmute and get my camera open again. No final comments. Enjoyed every minute of it, especially that dialogue between two of my faculty colleagues. Thank everyone for attending.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Celeste. And thank you to everyone. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email.
What's your email address?
ssawyer@AUP.
I already knew that.
Holly's already onto it.
Good. Yep. Good. We will send a follow-up email with links and email addresses and answer a couple more questions that we didn't quite get to. So, Stephen, thank you again.
Okay.
And everybody, see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.